I'm going to go back to what Alina Habba, Trump's attorney in the civil case in New York City that's playing out, had to say after court yesterday and after Trump's testimony about Letitia James and, the Honorable Judge Torquemada presiding over the trial.
They've got nothing but their politics. She's got nothing but her Soros backing, which we discovered recently. And I am sick and tired of seeing it. Pay attention, America. Pay attention. Because when you're in court one of these days and you don't have a lawyer that has a microphone and you don't have a lawyer that can go on TV and you've got judges gagging them, what are you going to do? We need to fix this country. And we need to stop what is happening in this courtroom. President Trump is worth a lot more, and she wasn't ready for it. She doesn't understand it. And before she rushed to judgment, she should have thought about attacking somebody with over 50 years of real estate expertise who changed single-handedly the skyline of New York City. She picked the wrong person, and her politics will fail for it.
For more on this, we're pleased to be joined. And by the way, I better be careful on name calling in the direction of the judge. I don't want to be hit with a gag order, fined $10,000. William Jacobson is a clinical professor of law, director of the Securities Law Clinic at Cornell Law School. He's also the founder of LegalInsurrection.com, president of the Legal Insurrection Foundation as well. Professor Jacobson, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me on.
Just now that we've got Trump's testimony completed, your latest and greatest handle on this prosecution by Letitia James, I suspect it hasn't changed terribly much.
No, it really hasn't. It was abusive when it started. It was disgraceful. She's a disgrace for using her office for political purposes. She announced when she ran for office that she was going to get Donald Trump and his family. She really has sullied the office. If he committed a crime or if he committed a civil offense, it could have been handled in the normal fashion, but she's the one who decided to make it all political. And it's a travesty. It really is a travesty. I think anybody doing business in the state of New York, and I work in the state of New York at Cornell, needs to be worried about what has happened to the Attorney General's office, that if you are on the wrong side of politics, you can be targeted. So I think the whole thing's disgraceful. The way she's been making public statements throughout this trial, essentially trying to taunt Trump in public with her video releases. I think the whole thing is a disgrace. And I think the judges handled it extremely poorly. I think that he should have heard testimony. He should have heard all the evidence before he ruled against Trump. What we're going through now is not actually the liability phase. Trump's already been found liable. They're just now it's just remedy. How badly are they going to damage him? The whole thing is ludicrous, and it's really shameful.
The relief that Trump has, we were talking about this before you came on, the suggestion that, we know what's going to happen here. We just, again, don't know the extent of the punishment to be imposed, as you just said. But then he can appeal that decision, but you can anticipate the courts in New York will rubber stamp this decision. Maybe you can't, but let's say you can. Does he have relief anywhere else? Do you see an angle for him to challenge the underlying constitutionality of the law under which he's being tried civilly and make like a Fifth, 14th Amendment claim to get into federal court and try to get this all the way to the Supreme Court? It doesn't seem to me there's much chance of that, or certainly no chance of an expedited appeal at the Supreme Court level, but people are thinking about this in the context of the presidential election and seeing if that changes anything in terms of his chances for relief at the federal level if he can't get it at the state level.
Yeah, I don't see that happening soon. I think he's going to have to exhaust his state appeals, and in New York State there are two levels of appeals. So he's in the state Supreme Court now, which oddly enough is the lowest court in New York, unlike most states. And the New York Supreme Court has an appellate division. You then go from the appellate division to the Court of Appeals, which is actually the highest court. So he has two levels of appeals at the state level. He could then try to go, depending what his claims are, to directly to the U.S. Supreme Court from the state's highest court. He would have to show some sort of federal constitutional issue. Might be complicated. I haven't really researched this by the fact that it's a civil trial, not a criminal trial. But I don't think the appellate level in New York, from my having practiced law for almost 40 years in New York, I don't think they're going to rubber stamp what happens.
Okay.
I think they will take a serious look. I'm not saying Trump's going to win on appeal, but I'm just saying that I don't think people should assume that the appeals courts in New York will, through political motivation, rubber stamp whatever the trial court does. The appeals courts in New York are not like Letitia James, okay? And so I think he'll get a legitimate appeal. Whether he's successful, I don't know. But, they are, unlike the trial courts where people are elected, judges are elected in New York. And so there's a lot of political influence there. The appeals courts are not. And, I think that, remember, it was the appeals courts in New York that threw out or upheld the throwing out of the Democrat gerrymandered maps for elections. So, you would say, oh, well, it's, a Democratic state. They'll just rubber stamp what the Democrats want. And they didn't. Okay. And so I think he'll get a legitimate appeal in New York State.
Okay. What about we've visited this topic before, but now that there's action at the state level, let's visit it again. The 14th Amendment Section 3 cases that have been filed in Michigan, Minnesota, and Colorado seeking to bar Trump from the ballot. The prospect of those cases being successful at the state level, and how, if they were, how quickly the Supreme Court might take up that issue.
Well, if any of those result in Trump being declared ineligible for the ballot, I think that's going to get on a very fast track to the Supreme Court, because that is, a federal election. It involves federal law. It involves the Constitution. So I think that if that happens, and I'm not convinced it will, and I think it's going to be on a fast track for the Supreme Court, because they've got to decide that issue.
And your view on the underlying issue, the idea that the language in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment would be applicable in the case based on the moving parties' characterization of January 6th, particularly given the original intent of that provision in the 14th Amendment to deal with those that were fought for the Confederacy, and, like, for example, the Vice President of the Confederacy wanted to reassume his congressional seat. What do you think about the actual standing of the argument that's being made by those individuals in those states?
Yeah, I think the Supreme Court's going to be dealing with somewhat uncharted territory, in the sense that you're right. That was there to address the armed insurrection against the United States. And no matter what you call January 6th, it was not an armed insurrection. No shots were fired, at least not by the demonstrators. There was a shot fired at Ashley Babbitt, but, so it's a very different situation. You would then have to say, well, who gets to decide what constitutes an insurrection? Is it any state official? Can any state official? Can they decide that Joe Biden refusing to enforce our immigration laws and opening the border, is that an insurrection against the authority of our country? Well, you'd say, well, no, he hasn't taken up arms against the country. Well, neither did Donald Trump. So if you're going to empower any local state election official or even state courts to make that decision, I think that's something the Supreme Court's going to need to sort through. And I don't know how they're going to decide it. The Constitution sets guidelines and principles for the country, but it doesn't necessarily resolve every issue. That's why we have so much litigation over what the Constitution means. I think the court's probably going to look for the history of that provision and say that even if all the allegations against Donald Trump are true, that contesting an election is not a violation of the 14th Amendment. Contesting an election is not in it of itself illegal. That's one of the things the media at the Democrats' urging has really put in people's minds, that trying to overturn an election is illegal. It's not. People try to overturn elections all the time. The question is, how do you do it? Did you do it by an illegal means? Democrats tried to overturn elections almost every time a Republican wins the presidency. They object to electors. They object to the count. They file lawsuits. They fight like hell to try to overturn the election. Nobody gets prosecuted for that. So I think the Supreme Court's not going to say, hey, any attempt to overturn an election or object to it is disqualifies you from running for office.
Professor Jacobson, can you tell us what's going on with Cornell Center for Jewish Living? I know that they had threats against them. The students had to hide in the library. Then apparently they were told to move to the attic because they couldn't keep them safe. School was canceled on Friday. What happened with the leadership at this school?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was two separate things. The hiding in the attic was Cooper Union in New York City, where quote-unquote pro-Palestinian, which really simply means anti-Israel, student protesters trapped some Jewish students in the library, and security told them to hide in the attic, which is eerie beyond belief because that's what happened, when the Nazis invaded European countries and Jews had to hide in the attics. I think that's a really good metaphor here. Cornell was a little different. Cornell, there were threats posted on a chat board by someone who claimed to be part of Hamas, or at least used that as a signature, about he's going to go around slitting throats, raping the Jewish women on campus, basically doing all the stuff Hamas did in southern Israel when they invaded on October 7. And it turns out that it was a Cornell undergraduate student, I think a junior, who posted those. The FBI was able to track his IP addresses and things like that through the chat board. And so that's Cornell. But Cornell has been raked by a lot of controversy, to put it mildly, because immediately after October 7th, after Hamas butchered, tortured, mutilated, and raped over 1,000 people in southern Israel, student groups protested in support of Hamas. A professor took the stage, and this got tons of play in the media, in a rally in downtown Ithaca, attended by a lot of students, and said he felt exhilarated when he heard of Hamas's attack. Of course, he said, oh, well, I didn't approve of everything they did, but, he was exhilarated when he heard about it. So Cornell has a real problem, and I've been saying this, and I've been saying this for many, many years, long before October 7th, that there is a racialized hatred brewing on the campus, which targets Jews, and which now has come out into the open. And so that's what Cornell, the perp has been arrested. He's in federal custody. Presumably he'll be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But Cornell has a very deep, deep problem that they refuse to acknowledge. And Cornell administration's reaction to October 7th was a mealy-mouthed, kind of both sides were concerned about everybody statement that created such a fury that the president had to issue a follow-up statement saying, oh, I didn't mean anything by failing to condemn Hamas. Oh, of course I condemn Hamas. And the administration, rather than addressing the underlying problem, which is the racialization of the campus with Jews left on the sideline under their DEI programs, is doubling down on DEI. They said, oh, well, we will, in response to this mass massacre of Jews, this mass anti-Semitism, this criminal threats on campus against Jews, guess what we're going to do? We're going to beef up our DEI resources on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. That's how they reacted.
And what do you think happens with Russell Rickford, Mr. Exhilarated by Hamas's attack? I know he's on leave from Cornell. Is he going to be back, do you think?
I think he will be. I don't think the administration's going to fire him. I think they'll probably give him another leave in the spring and hope by this time next year everybody's forgotten about it.
Professor William Jacobson, clinical professor of law, director of the